Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very fortunate to have Yolanda Youngs, who is an associate professor of geography at California State University, San Bernardino. Yolanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. This is really a great honor. I'm delighted to be present.
Well, you really have built a very solid career in our discipline. You have such a remarkable past in terms of where you've studied and who you've studied with. I consider this a privilege, truly. And I ask you now, as I ask many, what got you on this path to geography? If you could comment on maybe your childhood, adolescence, or studies as a college student, talk to us about it.
Yeah, I took a unusual path, but that's tough to say in our field because a lot of geographers didn't take the straightest path in field. My inspiration, certainly my childhood, I was raised on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and unfortunately really didn't feel right there. That wasn't my environment. I wanted 10,000-foot peaks and whitewater and rafting and ice climbing and hiking and camping and wilderness. And there's just not a lot of that right now in Florida. The 10,000-foot peak.
Yeah.
But what really inspired me was I love being outdoors. I've always loved that. I've loved field work. I didn't know that as a phrase early on in like high school. And but in college, I went to Florida State University for my undergraduate, and I majored in anthropology and archaeology. Did a lot of digs in Florida, and then do one in Italy, an Etruscan dig, and that was one of the second time I lived in Italy. But I loved the fieldwork part of it. I loved the various methods involved. I loved connecting real places and then analyzing those landscapes in some way. And quite frankly, I loved the physical labor of it, which there is distinctly some, as our anthropology and archaeology friends might attest. But as soon as I graduated, I, again, just really wanted different environments at the time. And so I got in my little Honda Civic and I drove straight from Florida to Yellowstone National Park, where I had spent some time as a kid on vacations, and I'd worked there on and off in the summers in my undergraduate years when I wasn't doing archaeology. And I was a contract archaeologist for a few years in Florida, and then, was going back and forth. But I really loved Yellowstone. And so I started working in the parks more seriously, but just service industry stuff, archaeology or anthropology or anything scholarship wise. But I fell in love with the parks, and I didn't quite know what I loved, except I loved the wildness. I was lucky enough to be in Yellowstone, which is just a tremendous, first national park in the world and in the United States, and lots of really beautiful backcountry areas. And then I got into, I took some time off from school. I took off several years between my undergraduate degree and graduate degree. And I got into being a commercial wilderness and multi-week raft guide. So I did whitewater trips. I worked for a very large company called OARS, OARS. And through that, I was, as I said, I spent just about a decade at the bottom of some canyon in the West on these multi-week trips with 30 clients usually and 4 to 6 guides beside myself. And they were, everything. We cooked, we rode rapids, we did all kinds of things. But one of the things I started to really enjoy, not only this tremendous opportunity to fall asleep every night under the stars and see these places, was that I moved, because it was such a large company, I could move around from the Green and the Yampa River up to the Snake River, move to the Southwest in the wintertime. And I realized that I was loving national parks, which I happened to be working in quite a bit on these rivers. And I was working seasonally, of course, following the flow of the water from winter to summer. But what I realized I was doing is really interpreting the landscapes, because as you float, I do these multi-week trips. So day one, day two, everybody's getting to know each other's names. Day three, day four, okay, now we know everybody, and now the interpretation sets in, along with the white, of course.
And you get to know the river. You get to know the landscape that river traverses. You get to know its story.
Right, right, exactly. And it was that combination of things that I loved. I was basically studying fluid geomorphology in the field. I knew river dynamics very well, as any professional raft guide who does, multi-day trips will know. Certainly day trip guides as well, but it's quite a different package when you're out there for weeks at a time, and very, remote locations, this is well before cell phones, but being there made me realize that I loved seeing the landscape. And of course, we would have these river guides anyways that would be, map-based books that would show us mile by mile the rapids and where camps were. But I started to basically, between trips, I would write out these mile by mile, basically a companion piece to interpreting the landscape as we were floating along. And I'd pass it out to the other guides so that we would have, more interpretation, basically, for those flat water sections on whitewater days. It's all about, the rapid and getting through it safely. But on those other flat water sections that are just beautiful, there was everything that we could talk about. There was the river itself and talking about, the physical geography, but then, talking about the animals. I knew we would probably see a bighorn sheep at mile, 244,
Wow.
or mile 16. I knew that there'd be a little cabin over here. So I would do the research when I was off the trip and write these things up, and then make them digestible about what I would kind of expect.
And there's a soundscape as well, where you have that flat water where you could just listen. And it's so magical in many ways.
It is absolutely. It's what brought me back. Many things brought me back year after year. There's also great camaraderie, and the quality of the guides I worked with were just excellent safety records and very professional. But there would always be one of us that brought a guitar recorder, and would play, and you could hear that sound sort of echoing around the canyons. And then, we could make a little extra money per trip if we had a special skill, besides of rowing these class 4 rapids, besides that, and cooking for people. And mine became interpretation. And so the interpretive guides that I'd write out, and I do them for different rivers. I started really working the oars, multiple states that the oars in different rivers. And so I fell in love with parks. And so after a while, I would, the other guides would say, you really could go back to school for this, I bet, and I thought, oh, okay, maybe. And so I thought about grad school, and through a longer story, basically ended up back in grad school. And I knew I wanted to go and study parks, and I knew I wanted to study rivers. But now it was, almost a decade that I'd been away from school, and a lot had changed. The critical turn had happened, for one, which I didn't know about at the time. Computers were more prevalent. I'd been away from school quite a bit. So, one of the things I connect with some of my students on is, if you've taken a break between school, sometimes it's hard to go back, even if it's to finish your undergrad, or maybe in my case to, go between your undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, which are quite different anyways. But I knew I wanted to study parks, and my favorite park at the time and area was the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so I knew I wanted to go back to Yellowstone and the Tetons. And I got out a map. I was always a very map-based person anyways. I've always been a very spatial visual thinker. And I looked at a map, and I looked at universities around Yellowstone, and applied to them, and to Montana State. And that was just a wonderful beginning to my geographic career.
Well, that's a great story. And so you arrive at the campus at Bozeman, and talk about your mentor.
Oh, I was so lucky. I actually started in the history program because, again, I'd taken off so many years. and the critical turn had happened, and some disciplines had changed their identifications, right, as we do. And so I came back in. I thought, well, maybe the thing I want to study is environmental history. I was again trying to read I was reading from the perspective of a public audience, trying to absorb scholarship at that point, right? Which is something I think about quite a bit now with my own scholarship. And that didn't quite fit me because it wasn't spatial and visual enough. And then someone said, well, if you want to study national parks, you really should talk to this geographer, Bill Wyckoff, and make an appointment with him. And I did. And it was, it's the appointment that changed my life. I'm so delighted, of course, and lucky to have not only met Bill, but worked with him. And he's, become a friend and colleague and continued mentor through the years. But he, talked to me about my experiences. He had other students who were working in not only national parks, but Yellowstone specifically. And it was just a wonderful fit. And he brought me into geography, which I'd taken many courses as an undergraduate. I took a lot of AP courses through high school. So by the time I hit college, I actually could have graduated in 2 years, but I take that time and I just took as many courses as I could. Somehow I never took geography. But then once I met Bill, of course, he was generous enough to invite me into the program, and I got my first taste of geography. And specifically, that program at the time was very good about balancing and training a very broad geographical view. So I was very clearly trained with 1 foot in cultural, 1 foot in physical. And it was also a transition time between sort of traditional cartographic training and aerial photo interpretation, and then moving into GIS. I was right at that time. And so,
it was unusual even at that time for graduate programs to facilitate a graduate student's interest across the broad spectrum of geography.
Yeah. Well, it's partially comes from that program. It's a earth sciences department. And so there was snow scientists there. There's also a strong geology side. Field work was always very important. And throughout my master's training, I would teach physical geography labs, as well as cultural geography classes, human geography classes. I would TA, that is the culture geography classes. I would actually get to teach the physical geography labs. And then we had a wonderful cohort of graduate students there that we helped each other with each other's field work, which was quite diverse, from the snow scientists who were using, dynamite to test avalanches. And then my work, which was, exploring this and building these landscape histories, basically, in the parks. And I had focused on, for my master's thesis, Yellowstone Lake, which was a lake that I was a raft guide, but also I was a multi-day touring kayak guide. So I did some kayak trips, and we go into the wilderness section of Yellowstone on Yellowstone Lake's southeast arm. And I loved that area. It was magical to me, and I knew it quite well from doing these 4-night, 5-day trips. And so I thought, well, I'll focus on Yellowstone Lake, and, did all the literature review and all those fun things you do. And I realized, there's an opportunity there, that there hasn't been that much research done on the cultural landscape history and the history of tourism. And also
it's very rich in that area, and that's in the northern part of the park as well. Well, I guess central.
Central, yeah. Central, south, it's part of that. The it's got this funny shape, the lake. Or I guess I should do that. The south and the southeast arm, the fingers, if you will, they dip down into the wilderness section of the park in the east, where the headwaters of the Snake River are. And it's tremendous. It was right. I started guiding right after the wolves were introduced to Yellowstone in 1995. And I didn't really see them on trips until, I would guess, 2001. I started to see wolves, on our trips, which was tremendous, and totally new. But the studying Yellowstone and Yellowstone Lake and interpreting those landscapes and doing that for my master's work, my research basically was half the week in the archives up at Mammoth in the north part of the park.
Right.
And the other half of the week, I was lucky enough that I kept guiding through grad school, and I would guide these kayak trips. I'd pack and rig and the routes for these kayak trips. And then I would, photocopy the, maps and historical imagery, whatever I was doing to try to compile this, figure out what had happened on that landscape over time. And I would share that with my clients, so, the people were paddling along with me, and I would give them, copies of the maps and everything. And at night around the fire, I'd say, okay, tomorrow we're going to look for a submerged boat dock. And that boat dock used to be here because they would do tours of the pelican colony on, and people enjoyed that, or at least they seem to enjoy that in terms of being on those trips and learning that kind of deep history and that kind of, backstage view, if you will, of the park, and then contributing to research too, because sometimes they would help me find, submerged pieces of the landscape that I was looking for, like boat docks or parts or whatever. But I was starting to weave together, as Bill Wyckoff might say, I was starting to weave together the parts of how I do my projects in terms of the research methods that I choose, the literature, of course, that was behind the scenes in all of that. And then, how much of it I wanted it to be for, direct scholarship and how much of it public facing. And I certainly have always built on that deep training I had, and I think very good training as a guide to talk to public audiences. And I it's not what we called it as river guides, but
it's not a typical academic kind of writing or presentation for a public audience, which is, I think, something we should really do more of as geographers. We should really be prepared to really create for the public a better image of geography, or at least an image of geography, But you say, Bill commented on how you have woven together all of these different entities associated with research and interests. Did you take classes from Bill?
Oh, I did. I was lucky enough.
Talk about him in the classroom.
Oh, he's tremendous. I mean, he's won at least one, if not multiple, teaching awards for his teaching. I was lucky enough to take classes with him, and then I was his TA for World Regional Geography, or as they called it there, when he was writing and revising his, wonderful textbook.
Which is continually being revised by that team of authors.
Yeah, and that was, there were so many lessons of working with Bill, and certainly Bill is a master weaver himself. I mean, I'm only emulating and trying to learn, continue to. But he not only did it with his research. If you read his articles, you can see how he'll pull these things together and weave this story. But his teaching style is very engaging and very, very connected with his students in a lot of different ways. And so I saw him in not only the small graduate seminars I took. At the time, he was teaching settlement geography, which, is not taught as much anymore. He had inherited that course and developed it quite a bit on his own, I believe. And so he exposed us to forthcoming or very recent books. He exposed us to great scholarship from scholars he was in dialogue with. So it was wonderful for a graduate student to see that very active research and to see it through his eyes. I also had the chance to talk with him and work with him as he was revising that major textbook. He was also writing his own books. At the time, he was writing his Montana repeat photography book while I was there. And then I would also, be his TA in these classrooms for World Regional Geography, which, were, I don't remember the number of students, but it was in one of these giant lecture halls, and to see Bill, he would have, 2 different screens up, one with the map, one with some notes. And this was overhead projector part of our era, right, of technology. And he would just flawlessly go between the two of, highlighting to students where we were and then showing him, this is where we are, and, using the projector to kind of highlight where we, the outline. But then one of the things he would do that I'd never seen any other professor do is he would very rarely, but he would bring in, and as his TA, I'd be part of this, bring in a slide projector, and he'd have his Kodak carousel set up with his slides from some place that he'd gone, and he was showing us him doing research and his own pictures of these places, right? And to see a great geographer curate a landscape basically for you and to be there and to talk about it, that was also some of the best training, not only in terms of how to be a, hopefully good teacher in the classroom and a scholar teacher, but then to see Bill talk to students about his photos and landscapes and connect it with, some pretty big ideas with, when you're teaching undergrad class, right? You have to, you're introducing really big concepts. And my job would be to sit in the middle of the room and click, when Bill gave me the sign, click, and go through those images. But just sitting there, I was just always mesmerized with the way he just fluidly talked about the places. Why did he take this picture? What should we see in this landscape? And it was the beginning of my training in landscape interpretation and talking about places, which I think is such an incredibly important thing that geographers do. And I think it's something we have to continue to do is really tell.
So it was really a very sensible transition for you to make when you went on for your PhD.
Made sense to me. I didn't have a lot of, I think there were only a very small number of, RAF guides that I'd worked with or knew through. I mean, you can imagine the network of RAF guides that do those multi-week trips. It's the entire Western US, but we all kind of floated and crossed paths at some point. And some folks went to graduate school. I've only known a couple that went to geography, but we all have that base of that guide training and then landscape interpretation as you're floating down the river, and it just unfolds before you, and
Sure.
it lends it telling those stories. So Bill, one of his many skills is he picks up on a student's, I think, innate qualities and capabilities. He adds to that. Of course, he helps you build that up, and he takes you where you want to go, which is a tremendous skill for a mentor as well.
Absolutely. And then you later went to Arizona.
Yeah. I once I took that big break between undergrad and grad, and then once I decided to go back to graduate school, I was full steam ahead. So you finished my degree at Montana State with Bill, and then moved to Tempe, to Arizona State, and just was incredibly lucky and delighted to be in that program. At that time, it was also transitioning. When I joined, the year I joined, it was, I believe, technically the last year it was a Department of Geography. And then the next year it became a School of Geographical Sciences. And then by the time I graduated, it was School of Geographical Sciences and Planning. And they've, of course, continued to grow beyond then. But Arizona was tremendous. And again, something that's been very strong throughout all my interests and my training is I love field work and I love field studies. And they had tremendous field scholars there. And they had, field programs, field methods classes, and I was very eager to learn that, coupled with and they were very welcoming of a broadly trained geographer who was equally interested in physical and cultural. And again, I had thought that I would go into fluvial geomorphology. I was on the river all the time. And then I realized I love to tell stories about human imprints on landscape as well. And I love to explore ideas of nature and culture and how they are translated sort of in the medium of landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and the American West is so fascinating in so many ways. It really, it's not just fascinating to the geographer who seeks to engage in field work, but it's enchanting. It captivates one to seek to understand a little bit more about why this happens where. And there in Tempe, you had an advisor that was also looking at the interpretation of landscapes.
Yeah, yes. Dan Ariely, I was, again, very lucky, very honored to work with another tremendous geographer. And Dan not only built upon, the solid groundwork that Bill had laid with me of learning about landscapes, interpreting landscapes, thinking as a geographer, thinking spatially, thinking visually. But I was lucky enough with Dan to go out on many of his field trips and be I guess, a field assistant. I would drive vans and I would learn from, because he would be teaching undergraduate courses and taking students to the U.S.-Mexico borderlands area, which is where he's done much of his research. But to see, again, a scholar in the field, I mean, there's nothing like a geographer, as I say, curating the landscape right before you, telling you this place that they know so deeply. It's unlike a guide or a tour guide of any sort, right? That maybe studied it and thinks about it. But when you have a scholar who is a geographically trained scholar who can interpret that landscape for others who maybe know it somewhat, or maybe they've never been there, or maybe they just study generally that area, but they haven't actually been to that place. It's tremendous. And so I learned not only to see through his eyes, which again, as with Bill, it was a tremendous, learning experience, but also I got to see how do you lead, how do you organize, how do you structure a field course, which is something I'm lucky enough to continue to teach myself at various levels. But there's an art to that as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, we all have our own unique passions as well as tools in our toolkit that we can apply to effectively engage in not only our research, but also in geographical instruction.
Yeah.
And you have come across some excellent mentors in your career that I'm sure are very proud of you and where you've gone with numerous publications accentuating the American West and national parks, great stories that are told in manuscript and books to articles. And you've told me about some more recent research you're working on in Italy. Would you like to comment for a moment or two on that?
Yeah, that's some of my more recent work, and hopefully I'm going to read that into my progression here as I move along. But it's an expansion of my base in public. I'm absolutely fascinated by public spaces and places and how formed, and again, through seeing it through the medium of landscape, how we invest these ideas about how nature should be managed. And it's often contested and it's often messy. And I just find that fascinating, sort of look at specific places and find those stories and then generalize them in a way that they connect with broader themes. So I've always been interested in that public spaces and places, as I mentioned, national parks and more broadly protected areas, which, so national parks, public lands like forests and fish and wildlife, any sort of federally managed public land. I've done some work in state parks, but really I'm more of a federal agency kind of person. But as an extension of that, I've also become interested in reconnecting with my international, I did live in Italy for a while. I'm like all geographers, I'm passionate.
Thank God.
Yeah. And so I've become very interested in UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which of course overlap. Some national parks are also World Heritage Sites. And so that was sort of my entree to it. And then as I looked back through my travels through the year, I taught World Regional for many years myself using Bill's book. And through the years, I realized that many of those national parks that I'd worked in, like Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, were World Heritage Sites. And then I looked at my travels and realized, oh, the Medina of Tunis, that's a World Heritage Site. When I go to Venice, which is my more recent site, heritage. And that concept is very interesting to me because it's in direct dialogue with the U.S. National Park System. So Yellowstone was established in 1872. The UNESCO system was established in 1972. Nice, clean connection there of 100 years. And in direct dialogue in that, they wanted to address many things, but one of them being protected areas that explicitly bring in human and biological, physical, however you might want to call it, but they're very aware of the nature culture connection. And I thought it was really fascinating and quite different from places like these big wilderness parks I work in. Yellowstone's 2.2 million acres, Grand Canyon's over 1 million. And here are these places, these UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and Venice, my more recent site, is one of these, where the whole city is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there are people living there, doing their daily lives, walking their dogs, amidst this. Same with Florence, a place that I'd lived in for a while, Firenze. So I really wanted to search this out. And I also noticed when I travel in Europe that if a site is marked as a World Heritage Site, it certainly gets a lot more tourism and a lot more attention. So I'm sort of tracing that, but for this project, I started it a few years ago, and then through the COVID years had to sort of suspend it, and now I'm able to sort of re-engage and go back. And I'm particularly interested in how these UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and particularly this one that's Venice, it's clearly coastal and marine. It's
sure.
It's an island state that's floating, basically. And how are they dealing with sea level rise? You see Venice quite a bit in the headlines of Venice is sinking, but Venice has been having high water for years. But what intrigues me is that Venice has engaged with this and said, we're going to make ourselves an international center of research for climate change. We're going to make ourselves a place where we encourage scholars to come and help us with this topic and study it, and study. They seem quite open to the methods that they are trying. They're trying these, various systems to try to manage the loop itself. But the thing about Venice is they've been, the humans of Venice, the Venetians, have been managing that lagoon for a very long time. This is not a new concept for them, but sea level rise, climate change, and then how are they finding social resilience amidst that? Venice has also been, really hit with a lot of mass tourism, especially before COVID. So I'm sort of looking at all of these factors, looking at historic maritime culture there as maybe a form of social resilience. Some of the traditional boating societies are now offering tourists an opportunity to learn how to boat like they do and get out on the boats, be they motor or non-motorized. So a couple of those different things, but I think what Venice is doing is so interesting in many ways, but one of them is really encouraging international scholarship. And this summer I'm going to go to the International Geographical Union conference there, and I know you're involved with IGU as well. And the conference starts in Milan and then moves to Venice, and it's just a very exciting opportunity to.
Well, that sounds wonderful because, as you've indicated, the landscape is much more complex than people realize, and engaging in an attack on solving a problem requires addressing a number of different issues and phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've been wading in that for so many years through the National Park Service, which also is an agency, a massive agency, 400 plus units in their system, and each one unique and different with a different context and such complex issues that they have to manage with this dual mission to protect and preserve the landscape at the same time that they have to make sure that it's accessible to tourists and for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. That's it.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, there are conflicts, and those have to be addressed in sensible manners.
Yes.
All this being said, Yolanda, we only have about a minute to go. I'm going to ask you if you have any words of advice for aspiring undergraduates or graduate students in geography, or even colleagues. Do you have any wise counsel you can impart to all of us?
Absolutely. I would say that following your passions, that's something I mentioned to my students quite a bit, and I do share an abbreviated version of my history with my students in terms of my path to being a geographer. In that, I knew I just had this drive inside of me that I knew I loved being outdoors. I loved field work. I loved parks. And I loved landscapes, although I didn't know the term when it was just an undergrad. I didn't quite understand the term as I do now. But I tell students, follow your passions. If you really, really want to study, coastal ecosystems, or if you really want to study, the downtown, part of a city, or whatever you want to study, follow that passion. But you've got to buttress that with wise choices of courses, and look for a network of mentors. So I've been so lucky with the mentors we've mentioned.
That you have been.
Yeah, but I have a very broad network of mentors
Sure.
who help me in various ways, in various times, and have helped guide me along in my career and my scholarship and my teaching. And so I encourage students to follow their passions and
Well,
to find a variety of networks of
we've only touched upon a parenthesis of your research, and we don't have time to talk about all the good work you've done in terms of your research, as well as for the American Association of Geographers and the Association of Pacific Coast Geographers. But our discipline has good reason to thank you for all you've done, and it's been a privilege to share this time with you as we conclude this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a true honor. Thank you for including me in this, and thank you for your service in collecting these stories from geographers as well.
Well, thank you.